Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I wanted to have a go at painting one of the new Skaven type miniatures, and in this first part I'm going to discuss painting the skin, fur, claws and other smaller details, and in the second part I'll cover the rest of the elements on the miniature including the metallics and the cloth. Now for this miniature I wanted to get somewhat close to the studio scheme, and if you have a look at the Clanrat miniatures that were painted by the studio, you'll soon see that they vary quite a lot in terms of different hues and tones on the skin. Now one of my favourite ways to approach this is to start off with a fairly pale skin tone, and then using washes and glazes to add different warmer tones into the fur and skin. If you've seen my previous Skaven video on the Patreon, you'll notice that I like to make my own desaturated skin tone mixes. Now this recipe in particular is one that I like to use, but feel free to experiment with this mix as you can add more of the Gorthor or Baneblade depending on the tone that you want to create. And don't think that you have to be limited to these particular colours either, as there's a lot of different mixes that will work for this. The most important part is to desaturate the skin tone to help it feel a bit more unhealthy and suitably Skaven-like. Now one of the easiest ways to do this is to simply add grey into the skin mix. As you can see here, it works with the usual skin tones like Cadian flesh tone or Kislev flesh as well. And this is also a recipe that will work really well for things like zombies, as you might remember from my previous video on that topic. The skin tones and fur for Skaven, just like on real rats, would vary quite a lot in nature, and changing this up across a unit can really help to create a diverse and more interesting army. So it's good to remember that the overall techniques are what's important here, rather than matching the exact colours used. Now, I know that going to the effort of making mixes can be off-putting and maybe even a bit daunting. However, one of the reasons I prefer to make mixes for this base coat is not just to add a natural variation in the skin tone, but also just because it covers so much better than say something like Rakarth flesh. And I found that I was able to get a pretty smooth base coat here just by simply applying it by brush over a couple of thin layers. Now once that was dry, I wanted to start establishing the main colours for the fur. Brown is an obvious choice here, so I made a mix of Rhinox hide and Mournfang brown for this, mixing this into my skin base coat first to create some softer transitions. Pretty much any browns will work well, as well as warmer grey tones and perhaps even white or cream for an albino look, so do feel free to experiment with different colours, especially if you're painting a larger unit. Again, creating variation here can really help to add some visual interest. So I'm also using this brown mix to create shading on the shapes of the muscles on the body, and even using it as a glaze to change the overall tone of the skin, whilst leaving the hands and the feet and some of the face much lighter. The next step now is to darken down the fur even further using some Rhinox hide, but first I used this same colour to quickly pick out the claws on the feet and the hands of the Skaven. For the fur itself I'm thinning the paint slightly less, and just mostly blocking in these areas, but then I'm also going around with a thinned down Rhinox hide and glazing this into the body of the Skaven and areas that I want to darken down further. This also helps to smooth the transitions into the fur itself. Next I went on to base coat the tail, and for this I used Bugman's Glow. This is just a nice warmer mid-tone fleshy colour, but if you don't have this particular paint you could try mixing a lighter skin tone like Cadian flesh tone with Doomball and a touch of Corn Red. You could even use a bit of Screamer Pink if you want to push the tail itself even more pink, and I also used the same Bugman's Glow to pick out the nose and the ears. Now for the shading. I first created a mix of Doomball brown and Corn Red, and to this I added just a touch of black to darken it slightly. This is then thinned to a glaze consistency, and I also added a touch of Vallejo Glaze Medium just to help it apply more evenly. I'm going to use this mix to shade around the more fleshy areas like the hands, feet, nose and ears. I also use this same mix to shade the tail, allowing the thin mix to find the recesses and applying more than one layer if needed. If you wanted to here, you could also add something like Screamer Pink into the mix to add some further variation to the tail. I then added a touch more black into this mix, which created a darker shade that could be used between the fingers and toes, and any areas that I needed a deeper shade. Once all of the shading was finished, it was time to start tidying up these areas, and usually I'll spend a little bit of time with this step just refining and smoothing out the transitions as much as needed. If this is something for an army project, I would suggest that this is one area that you could cut back a bit of time on. I would still go back in and tidy a bit, but there's less need to refine every blend, because especially once the highlights are established, it'll have the effect of distracting from any unsmooth blends anyway. My goal here is not to completely go over all of the shading I've already established, but instead to build this up more slowly and to keep the transitions as smooth as I can. And I'm paying more attention here to the top of muscles and areas that would naturally catch more of the light. Next, I went on to start adding some highlights, and first of all I worked on the nose and the ears. For this, I made a mix of Bugman's Glow and Ushabti Bone, around a 2-to-1 mix to begin with. And this was then further highlighted by adding more Ushabti Bone into the mix. Now once I was happy with this, next it was time to add some highlights to the skin, and for this you can simply add some white into the base mix that we created earlier. I personally like to add a touch more of the Baneblade brown into this, so more Baneblade mixed into the admin grey and then white added into that. The specific colours don't really matter too much, and you could either use a very pale grey and white like I have, or you could opt to use a warm off-white like Wraithbone instead. I'm not entirely sure the exact recipe that they used on the box art versions, but it was most likely something like this, and again variation is good to have, so play around with the different methods to see what you prefer. Now onto highlighting the fur itself, and I found it's important here not to make the transition into the fur look too obvious. For this reason, I pick a highlight colour for the fur that's also very similar to the other colours on the miniature, starting with the original fur mix of Rhinox hide and Mournfang brown, and then simply adding increasing amounts of Administratum grey into the mix. And for each stage, I'm highlighting further towards the end of the fur. Again, just like the skin here, as long as the highlight colour is lighter in value, different neutral tones like greys, cream or beige like Carrickstone and Ushabti bone tend to work best for this, and you could use these to highlight the usual different tones of rat fur like black, grey, cream, white or brown. So it's worth experimenting with this and adding some variation across a unit. Now it was time to start rendering the tail, and I started to relayer the segments of tail using Bugman's Glow, leaving the previous shading stage in the recesses. Here, I've also mixed some Doomball Brown and some Screamer Pink together, and then I added this mix into the Bugman's Glow to create some additional shading towards the bottom of the segments of the tail. I then continued layering up the Bugman's Glow towards the end of the tail. Now for the highlights on the tail, I wanted to create a more fleshy tone, so I first added some Kislev flesh into the Bugman's glow, using this to pick out the edges of the individual segments. Next, I added a touch of grey into the previous mix to further pick out some brighter highlights, concentrating this towards the top of the segment. Lastly, I added some white into the mix for the final sharpest highlights on the tail. When it came to painting the teeth, I first base coated them using Hobgrot hide with a touch of Mournfang mixed in, but basically any yellowy brown tone will work well for this. Something like Hobgrot, Baylor Brown, or even Zamisi Desert. We just want a hint of yellow here that's typical with rat teeth. This was then highlighted by adding progressively more Shabti bone into the mix. Now for the eyes, I first decided to paint them pretty much like lenses, starting off with Mephiston Red and then highlighting this using Evil Suns, followed by Trollslayer Orange, Towelite Ochre, and then finally a dot of white. At the end, I wasn't quite happy with this and I decided to repaint them with more central highlights, using all of the same colours but instead building up the highlights in the middle of the eye and creating a slight glow effect. I think both methods can work, however, I think I prefer the second one on this occasion, which also just so happened to be the simpler one. And I think sometimes it's just better on smaller areas like this not to overcomplicate the process too much, as I think it's possible to lose some readability in doing so. For the claws, I wanted a slightly darker and more desaturated red than the eyes, so I first opted to use a base coat of corn red. This was followed by mixing in some squig orange for the first highlights. This was followed by Towelite Ochre, and finally I added some white into that for the sharpest highlights, and for the dot highlight at the top of the claws. And that's about it for this video. Join me in the next part when I'll continue painting the cloth, metallics and other final details. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you again very soon.